Hi there. Welcome to NapTime History channel. Tonight we venture into the gilded bedrooms and twisted corridors of royal palaces where love, power, and madness intertwined in ways that would make modern reality TV look tame. You're standing in the Alcazar of Madrid, watching a young king struggle to chew his own food, while courtiers pretend not to notice the drool pooling on his Habsburg chin. The year is 1679, and Charles II of Spain, a man so inbred his family tree resembles a telephone pole, is about to marry for the first time. Fair warning, if you thought your family gatherings were awkward, you probably won't survive the genetic horror show we're about to explore. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing whether you're procrastinating at work in Tokyo or actually trying to sleep in Toronto. All right, let's begin the story. You're watching Charles II of Spain attempt to consummate his marriage to Marie Louise of Orleans, though attempt might be the kindest word anyone could use for this disaster. The poor French princess, vibrant and healthy when she arrived in Madrid, finds herself married to a man whose genetic coefficient would make a Kentucky Derby winner jealous. Charles's ancestry reads like a cautionary tale. In recursive mathematics, his grandmother was also his aunt, making his father simultaneously his great-uncle. Scientists in 2009 actually calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, higher than if his parents had been siblings. Mainstream historians note that Charles suffered from mandibular prognathism so severe he couldn't close his mouth. But the quirky detail often missed is that palace servants had to pre-chew his food and spit it into his mouth like a baby bird. The marriage bed becomes a stage for medical impossibility. You watch physicians debate whether Charles's infamous impotence stems from his undescended testicles or his kidneys that leaked blood. Marie Louise, desperate to produce an heir, subjects herself to fertility treatments that would horrify modern medicine, drinking bull's blood mixed with holy water, having her bedsheets blessed by different saints each night, even wearing amulets made from the dried wombs of rabbits. Palace gossips, because yes, even in 1680 people loved their tea, whisper that the Queen has taken lovers, though historians still argue whether these affairs were real or merely wishful projections from a court desperate for any heir, legitimate or otherwise. The truly perverted part isn't just the sexual dysfunction, it's the systematic delusion. You're witnessing an entire empire pretend that this walking genetic catastrophe could father children. Courtiers praise the king's virility while he soils himself during state meetings. Priests declare each failed pregnancy attempt a test from God rather than accepting the obvious biological impossibility. The Spanish Empire, spanning continents and controlling vast wealth, hinges its entire future on the malfunctioning genitals of a man who believes himself bewitched because that's easier than admitting 3 centuries of Habsburg marriages between uncles and nieces might have been a mistake. 10 years into this matrimonial farce, Marie Louise dies suddenly at age 27 You smell the bitter almonds on her lips, cyanide, though officially it's acute indigestion. Whether she poisoned herself to escape or was murdered by courtiers wanting a potentially fertile queen remains one of those scholarly debates that keeps history conferences lively. Charles, barely comprehending his wife's death through his fog of genetic disabilities, immediately agrees to marry again. Because surely, the thinking goes, the problem was with Marie Louise, not with the king, whose autopsy would later reveal intestines filled with water, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and a brain described by the coroner as containing no drop of blood. You're in Rome now, 64 AD, where Emperor Nero has just kicked his pregnant wife, Poppaea, to death in a fit of rage over her complaints about his late returns from the chariot races. But here's where things take a turn that would make even Charles II's physicians uncomfortable. You watch Nero's eyes fall upon a young slave boy named Sporus, whose delicate features remind the emperor of his dead wife. What follows isn't just marriage. It's a complete psychological breakdown, dressed in imperial purple and sold to the Roman public as divine love. The castration happens in a villa outside Rome, performed by the emperor's personal physicians, who've been promised either wealth beyond measure or crucifixion, depending on the outcome. You hear Sporus's screams echo through marble halls while Nero paces outside, clutching a portrait of Poppaea and muttering about resurrection through flesh. The boy survives, barely, and spends months recovering while seamstresses work frantically to recreate Poppaea's entire wardrobe in his size. Palace slaves whisper that Nero visits the recovering eunuch nightly, calling him Poppaea and speaking to him as if nothing has changed, as if wombs and testicles were merely interchangeable accessories. The wedding ceremony defies every Roman tradition you've ever heard of. Nero insists on a full traditional marriage, complete with the flame-colored veil meant for virgin brides, though everyone knows Sporus was neither virgin nor bride nor, technically speaking after the castration, fully anything at all. The emperor places a wedding ring on Sporus's finger while senators struggle to maintain straight faces. Some historians argue this was purely political theater, Nero's way of mocking traditional values, but the disturbing tenderness in surviving accounts suggests something far more unhinged, a man so desperate to undo his crime that he'd mutilate another human being into a living memorial. You follow the newlyweds through their daily routine, which would be almost normal if you could ignore the fact that Sporus must respond to his dead predecessor's name. Nero parades his bride boy through Rome in Poppaea's jewelry, her cosmetics carefully applied to Sporus's face each morning by slaves who've been instructed to recreate her exact appearance. The emperor even insists Sporus adopt Poppaea's mannerisms, her way of laughing, her favorite phrases. Court records mention Nero flying into rages when Sporus's voice, despite the castration, occasionally drops too low, shattering the illusion. These outbursts usually end with beatings that servants rush to cover with powder and paint. The perversion reaches its peak during public appearances. You're standing in the Circus Maximus, watching Nero kiss Sporus before thousands of Roman citizens who must cheer or risk death. The emperor makes long speeches about the power of love to transcend death, while Sporus stands silent in Poppaea's clothes, dead-eyed as a mannequin. Foreign ambassadors report home about Rome's mad emperor who married his wife's ghost made flesh, though they're careful to couch it in diplomatic language. The fascinating detail often overlooked: Sporus outlived Nero, passing between several powerful Romans like a cursed heirloom, each keeping him dressed as Poppaea until he finally committed suicide rather than be publicly raped in the arena as part of a mythological reenactment. Modern psychologists would have a field day with Nero's particular brand of marital perversion, the narcissism, the refusal to accept consequences, the literal attempt to reshape reality through surgical intervention. But you're struck by something else as you watch Sporus apply his daily costume: the bureaucratic efficiency with which an entire empire enabled this madness. Tax records list Sporus as Empress Poppaea Sabina. Official documents refer to her with feminine pronouns, and coins were minted showing Nero with his restored wife. It's not just one man's delusion, it's systematic gaslighting on an imperial scale, proving that with enough power, you can force everyone to participate in your psychiatric breakdown. You're standing in a torchlit chamber in Tordesillas, Spain, where Queen Juana of Castile sits beside an open coffin, gently combing the hair of her husband, Philip the Handsome, who's been dead for 3 months. The smell would knock you flat if this were real, a mixture of myrrh, rose oil, and the underlying sweetness of decay that no amount of perfume can mask. Juana hums softly, a Flemish lullaby Philip used to request, while her ladies-in-waiting press handkerchiefs to their faces and try not to gag. This isn't grief. This is love, perverted into something that makes Nero's delusions look almost quaint. The marriage started conventionally enough in 1496, a political alliance between Spain and Burgundy sealed with 2 attractive teenagers who actually found each other irresistible. You watch their early years unfold like a romance novel: passionate letters, constant lovemaking, 6 children in quick succession. But Philip's wandering eye transforms Juana's devotion into something darker. She attacks his mistresses with scissors, once attempting to cut off a rival's face because Philip had complimented the woman's complexion. Courtiers start using the word mad in their dispatches, though historians still debate whether Juana's behavior stemmed from mental illness or justified rage at her husband's flagrant infidelities. Philip dies suddenly in 1506, officially from fever, though the speed suggests poison and you can smell bitter almonds again, apparently the preferred termination method for inconvenient royals. Here's where Juana's love takes its grotesque turn. She refuses to bury him, insisting instead on traveling with his corpse across Spain. You're part of history's most macabre road trip, a funeral procession that won't end, stopping at monasteries where Juana demands the monks open the coffin so she can kiss her husband's blackening lips. She forbids any women from approaching the casket, convinced even in death that hussies might seduce Philip's corpse. The midnight inspections become ritual. You watch Juana order the coffin opened by trembling servants who've learned to breathe through their mouths. She examines Philip's body with the attention of a detective, checking that all his parts remain attached, She's paranoid about relic hunters stealing pieces of her beloved. One night, discovering his big toe has fallen off, she flies into a rage that results in 3 servants being flogged. She keeps the toe in a jeweled box beside her bed, kissing it each night before sleep. The quirky historical detail rarely mentioned, she also collected his loosened teeth and fingernails, having them set into rings and necklaces she wore daily. 8 months into this traveling horror show, Juana gives birth to Philip's posthumous daughter, conceived during what she insists were conjugal visits from his spirit, but what servants darkly suspect were encounters with palace guards taking advantage of a delusional queen. She names the baby Catherine after her sister, yes, the same Catherine married to that human genetic heir Charles II would later descend from, and insists on placing the infant in the coffin with Philip so father and daughter can meet. The baby's screams finally convince her to retrieve the child, though she interprets the cries as Philip expressing displeasure at being disturbed. The perversion here isn't sexual, it's the complete dissolution of the boundary between life and death, love and possession. You're witnessing a woman so unable to accept loss that she creates an alternative reality where corpses are merely sleeping deeply. Her father, Ferdinand, finally intervenes, locking Juana in Tordesillas Palace, where she'll spend the next 46 years, but he allows her to keep Philip's body for several more years. She sets up their bedroom exactly as it was, laying out fresh clothes for him each morning, setting his place at table, speaking to the coffin about their children's achievements. Servants report that on quiet nights, they hear her side of complete conversations, pausing for Philip's responses. Whether this was madness or the world's most committed performance art remains one of those academic arguments that'll never be settled. Though the fact that she outlived Philip by 49 years suggests a certain methodical stamina to her delusion. You're watching Henry VIII waddle through Hampton Court Palace, his ulcerated leg leaking pus that leaves a trail servants frantically mop behind him, while he dictates love letters to his 5th teenage bride. By 1540, this man has turned marriage into England's bloodiest spectator sport, and you're about to witness how one king's desperate need for a male heir perverted the entire concept of matrimony into something unrecognizable. The portrait painters work overtime to maintain the illusion of virility, but you see the reality, a 300-pound tyrant whose codpiece requires structural engineering and whose breath could strip paint. Let's review Henry's marital scorecard, shall we? Catherine of Aragon, married for 24 years until Henry discovered a convenient biblical verse about not sleeping with your brother's widow, never mind that he'd needed papal dispensation to marry her in the first place. You sit through the endless theological debates where learned men twist scripture like balloon animals to justify whatever Henry wants today. The mainstream historical fact everyone knows is that Henry created the Church of England for his divorce. But here's the bizarre detail. He made his own daughter, Mary, sign a document declaring herself a bastard, essentially forcing a teenager to legally erase her own legitimacy for her father's new marriage plans. Anne Boleyn enters the scene like a French tornado, refusing to become another royal mistress, holding out for the crown with a sexual poker game that lasts 7 years. You watch Henry pour the equivalent of England's entire GDP into love tokens, jeweled initials, custom sleeves, an entire deer park shaped like a heart, visible only from her bedroom window. But 3 years and one miscarriage later, suddenly Anne's extra finger, probably just a fingernail, but rumors grow in telling, becomes a sign of witchcraft. The charges are spectacular in their absurdity: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, though you notice the dates include times when Anne was literally giving birth. Henry orders a special swordsman from France for her execution. Apparently, even his murderous convenience has standards. Wife 3, Jane Seymour, gets the fairy tale treatment because she has the good sense to die 12 days after giving Henry his precious son. You're in the birthing chamber, watching infection set in while Henry celebrates elsewhere, already eyeing portrait miniatures of potential fourth wives. He'll mourn Jane forever, of course, conveniently forgetting how he was already negotiating for a French princess while she lay dying. The perversion here isn't sexual, it's the commodification of women's bodies as air-producing machinery, discarded the moment they malfunction. The Anne of Cleves disaster provides comic relief in this matrimonial horror show. Henry, who's been catfished by Holbein's flattering portrait, meets his fourth bride in disguise, because fat, limping kings make great mysterious strangers, and she fails to recognize him. His ego never recovers. You watch him claim the marriage was never consummated due to her evil smells, though Anne's later testimony suggests Henry's equipment simply wouldn't cooperate. Remember that infected leg wound was slowly poisoning his entire system. The truly twisted part: they remain friends after the annulment, with Anne smart enough to agree she's too ugly for the king in exchange for multiple castles and the honorary title of beloved sister. Catherine Howard, wife 5, is where Henry's delusions reach their apex. At 49, he marries a teenager who's been passed around the Tudor court since age 13, then acts shocked, when evidence surfaces of her continued affairs. You watch him weep before his council, playing the betrayed innocent while signing her death warrant. Palace servants whisper about finding the king practicing his surprised and heartbroken face in mirrors. Catherine's execution is so botched, the traumatized executioner needs 3 strikes, but historians still debate whether her famous last words about dying a queen, but rather as a wife, were real or Tudor propaganda. By wife 6, Catherine Parr, even Henry seems exhausted by his own game. She's more nurse than wife, applying poultices to his rotting leg while he rewrites his will every few months, adding and removing heirs like a sociopathic game of musical chairs. The real perversion of Henry's marriages isn't just the beheadings, it's how he transformed an entire nation's religious and legal structure to accommodate his personal dysfunction, making England complicit in his pathological need to blame women for his own failing body. You're reclining at a banquet in Imperial Rome, circa 39 AD, watching Emperor Caligula tongue-kiss his sister Drusilla while announcing their divine marriage to a room full of senators trying not to vomit into their wine cups. The smell of incense can't quite mask the scent of fear sweat from men who know the wrong facial expression could mean death. This isn't just incest, it's incest wrapped in theology and served with a side of state-mandated worship. Remember Charles II's genetic disasters? At least the Habsburgs pretended uncle-niece marriages were normal. Caligula decided to skip the pretense and go straight for deification. The relationship started innocently enough. If you can use that word for anything involving Caligula, you watch him grow up with his three sisters in Tiberius's court on Capri, that island of depravity where the old emperor allegedly trained children to nibble his genitals while he swam. Historians debate whether Tiberius's minnows were real or character assassination, but everyone agrees Caligula learned that power means never having to say, "That's perverted." By the time he becomes emperor at 24, his favorite sister Drusilla has been married off to some forgettable senator named Lepidus, a detail Caligula finds merely inconvenient. The emperor's solution is breathtakingly simple. He moves Drusilla into the palace and starts appearing with her at official functions in matching purple robes. You're at one of these ceremonies, watching Caligula declare that, like Zeus and Hera, divine siblings naturally mate. The fact that Zeus and Hera's marriage produced Ares, god of war, not exactly a ringing endorsement for incestuous unions, seems lost on everyone. Lepidus still technically exists, skulking around the palace edges like furniture no one remembers ordering, while Caligula openly gropes his sister during Senate meetings. Here's the quirky detail often missed. Caligula didn't just marry his sister, he insisted on planning their divine children's future careers. You sit through endless monologues about how their offspring would be gods governing specific aspects of Roman life, one for aqueducts, another for taxation, a third for theatrical performances. He commissions statues of these hypothetical deity babies, placing them in temples before Drusilla even shows signs of pregnancy. Priests are forced to develop entirely new prayer protocols for unborn gods, creating theological frameworks for children who exist only in an incestuous emperor's imagination. The sexual mechanics of this divine union become public spectacle. Caligula installs a two-way mirror system, polished metal, but the principle holds in their bedchamber, charging admission for senators to watch the gods create new deities. You're unfortunately present for one of these viewings. 24 of Rome's most powerful men pretending to find spiritual enlightenment in watching imperial incest while Caligula provides running commentary on his divine virility. One senator, Lucius Vitellius, becomes so accomplished at feigning religious ecstasy during these sessions that Caligula promotes him to consul. Apparently nothing says qualified for high office like convincingly orgasmic reactions to your boss's sex life. When Drusilla dies suddenly in 38 AD fever, though poison remains possible because it's Rome and someone's always poisoning someone, Caligula's grief transforms into something even more disturbing than his love. He declares her a full goddess, demanding the Senate vote on her divinity while her body still lies warm. You watch him insist on personally washing her corpse, applying cosmetics with his own hands, then keeping her body in his bed for a week before allowing cremation. He establishes a cult of Drusilla, complete with virgin priestesses who must swear they've seen the goddess ascending to heaven. The penalty for expressing doubt about Drusilla's divinity. Death. Naturally, the perversion culminates in Caligula's treatment of his two surviving sisters, Agrippina and Livilla. Unable to replace Drusilla, he forces both into his bed simultaneously, creating what one traumatized court recorder called a divine trinity of flesh. When they later conspire against him, shocking that sisters forced into incestuous threesomes might harbor resentment, he exiles them to islands and turns their punishment into public entertainment, reading their love letters aloud and rating their sexual performance compared to the deified Drusilla, even by Roman standards, where emperors collected wives like Pokemon cards. Caligula's marriage to his dead sister's ghost, while sexually tormenting her living siblings, represented a new low in imperial perversion. You're in the Kremlin's drafty halls, 1571, watching Ivan the Terrible interview potential bride number 6 by having her strip naked and walk in circles while court physicians check her teeth like a horse at auction. 5 wives down, 2 more to go, and each marriage has ended worse than the last, a carnival of poison, drownings, and forced convents that makes Henry VIII look like a committed monogamist. The woman currently being inspected, Marfa Sobakina, shivers in the cold while Ivan critiques her hip width and breast symmetry with the clinical detachment of a man who's confused wives with livestock. Let's rewind to wife number 1, Anastasia Romanovna, the only one Ivan seemed to genuinely love, which in his case meant he waited 13 whole years before probably poisoning her. You watch their early years together, almost normal by royal standards, until Anastasia dies mysteriously in 1560. Modern tests on her remains found mercury levels that would kill a small elephant, though Ivan blamed boyar conspiracies and launched a reign of terror that made his previous violence look like gentle correction. The man who'd later roast political enemies on giant frying pans started his descent into matrimonial madness, convinced everyone wanted to murder his wives before he could get around to it himself. Wife 2, Maria Temryukovna, a Circassian princess, arrives in Moscow to discover Ivan's idea of honeymoon activities includes forcing her to watch executions from their bedroom window. You're at one of these charming date nights. Ivan pointing out the artistic way intestines unspool while Maria vomits behind a silk screen. She mysteriously dies 8 years later, Mercury again, because apparently Ivan's court only knew one poison recipe. The quirky historical detail? Ivan kept her skull in his treasury, occasionally bringing it out during later marriage negotiations to show prospective brides what beauty used to look like. A serial killer's show and tell that somehow didn't immediately send every eligible woman fleeing to convents. Marfa Sobakina, bride 3, breaks records by dying 2 weeks after the wedding. Before consummation, even Mercury needs more time than that. Ivan, never one to let facts interfere with paranoia, declares the marriage invalid due to non-consummation and immediately starts bride hunting again. You watch him develop an efficient system, mass auditions, where thousands of young women are herded through the Kremlin like a medieval Miss Universe pageant. Court physicians examine everything from hymen integrity to toe spacing, creating detailed charts rating each woman's breeding potential. The process is so dehumanizing that several contestants faint, which Ivan interprets as feminine delicacy rather than justified terror. Anna Koltovskaya becomes wife 4, lasting an impressive 3 years before Ivan decides she's barren, despite his advanced syphilis likely being the fertility problem, and ships her to a convent. Here's where Ivan's marital perversions take a theological turn. The Orthodox Church only allows 3 marriages, so wives 4 through 8 are technically illegal. Ivan solves this by declaring himself a special case, too important for God's rules. You sit through bizarre church councils where terrified priests invent new doctrines on the spot, explaining why the Tsar's 4th marriage is actually his first in a complicated spiritual mathematics that would make Caligula's godchildren seem logical. Wife 5, Anna Vasilchikova, gets the honor of being married to Ivan during his Simeon Bekbalatovich phase, where he pretends to abdicate, installs a puppet czar, then lives as a humble nobleman who coincidentally still controls everything. You watch this psychological theater play out in the bedroom, where Ivan insists Anna call him Simple Ivan while he holds a blade to her throat. She lasts 2 years before, surprise, dying mysteriously. Vasilisa Melentieva, unofficial wife 6 or 7, depending on how you count, doesn't even get a real wedding, just a blessing from whatever priest Ivan can threaten into compliance. She's found drowned in a palace pool, though Ivan claims she fell while possessed by demons that made her sexually inadequate. The true perversion isn't just the murders, it's Ivan's transformation of marriage into a state terror mechanism. Each wedding becomes a public reminder that even the most intimate relationships exist at his psychotic whim. By his final marriage to Maria Nagaya, you're watching a man so paranoid he tastes his bride's tears for poison, so twisted he makes her wear the jewelry of all his dead wives simultaneously, creating a walking memorial to his marital violence. When she gives birth to his son Dmitri, whom Ivan will later murder in a rage, he celebrates by executing several boyars who looked too happy about the heir, because in Ivan's world, even joy is suspicious. You're crammed into a Roman brothel in 48 AD, watching Empress Messalina compete against the city's most experienced prostitute in history's most degrading competition, who can service more men in a single night. The reigning champion, a woman named Scylla, who's worked these streets for 20 years, gives up after 25 clients, collapsing in exhausted defeat. But Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of Britannicus, and technically the most powerful woman in the empire, keeps going. The brothel reeks of sweat, cheap wine, and desperation as you count along with the stunned madam, 50, 75, still going as dawn breaks over the Subura district. How does a teenage bride from Rome's highest nobility end up in a prostitution contest? You've watched Messalina's marriage to Claudius from the beginning. She was 15, he was 48, drooling, twitching, and widely considered the family embarrassment until the Praetorian Guard made him emperor as a joke that got out of hand. The mainstream historical narrative paints her as a nymphomaniac, but modern historians debate whether her behavior was pathological sexuality or a deliberate political strategy to humiliate a husband she despised. Either way, you're witnessing something that makes Ivan's Bride auctions look tasteful. The competition wasn't even Messalina's first venture into commercial sex work. You followed her on multiple nights when she sneaks out of the palace wearing a blonde wig and calling herself Lysiska, she-wolf, because subtlety isn't her strong suit. She rents a cubicle in the brothels, hangs up a price list, and services customers who have no idea they're literally fucking the Empress. The quirky detail Roman historians love to mention. She insisted on being paid the standard rate, not for the money, but because she wanted the authentic experience. Palace accountants find receipts where the Empress of Rome carefully tracked her prostitution earnings like a small business owner. Back to the competition, Messalina's endurance horrifies even the brothel's regulars. You watch her maintain what witnesses called terrifying enthusiasm through client after client, applying olive oil with the efficiency of a production line. The other prostitutes, initially amused by this rich woman's slumming, grow increasingly disturbed as hours pass. One veteran whore reportedly muttered that Messalina fucked like she was trying to prove something to the gods, which might be the most insightful psychological assessment in ancient history. By the time she finally stops, not from exhaustion, but because the brothel closes, she's reportedly serviced over 100 men and still complains about being unsatisfied. The perversion deepens when you realize Claudius knows. The emperor, despite his reputation as a doddering fool, receives detailed intelligence reports about his wife's activities. You sit in on palace meetings where spy masters delicately try to inform him that the empress spent last night working at alternative employment. Claudius responds by discussing aqueduct construction, willfully oblivious. Historians still argue whether this was senility, political calculation, or a humiliation fetish so advanced it required an entire empire's participation. The man who'd later write scholarly treatises on dice games apparently couldn't figure out why his wife kept coming home at dawn covered in strangers' fluids. Messalina's sexual Olympics culminate in the ultimate perversion of marriage. She actually marries another man while still married to Claudius. Not secretly, but in a full public ceremony with witnesses, contracts, and a wedding feast. You're at this surreal event, watching the Empress marry her lover, Gaius Celius, while legally married to the sitting emperor. The guests shift nervously, unsure if they're participating in treason, performance art, or some bizarre imperial sex game. When Claudius's freedmen finally convince him this crosses a line, apparently the 100-man brothel marathon didn't. Messalina tries to seduce the soldiers sent to kill her, maintaining her nymphomaniac persona to the very end. The truly twisted element isn't just Messalina's compulsive sexuality, it's how she weaponized it against the entire concept of imperial dignity. Every public orgasm was a political statement, every brothel visit a calculated insult to an empire that prized female virtue. You're watching a woman so committed to degrading her husband's authority that she turned her own body into a biological weapon of mass humiliation. Whether she was mentally ill or politically brilliant remains one of those historical debates that will never be settled. Though the fact that Claudius had to execute his own wife for excessive prostitution suggests the Roman Empire had finally found a marital perversion even it couldn't tolerate. You're standing in a snowbound Russian military camp in 1711, watching Peter the Great test his mistress Catherine's loyalty by having her witness the execution of her former lover. She doesn't flinch as the man's head rolls across the frozen ground, maintaining eye contact with Peter throughout the beheading. This is marriage as endurance test, and Catherine, an illiterate Lithuanian peasant who started as a war captive, passed between Russian officers, is about to become Empress of all Russia through sheer determination to survive whatever perverted tests Peter devises. Remember Messalina's sexual marathons? At least those were voluntary. Catherine's path to the crown is paved with psychological torture disguised as courtship. Let's trace how Martha Skoronska, a Catholic servant girl, transforms into Catherine I of Russia. You watch her get captured during the Great Northern War, passed from soldier to soldier like human currency. She ends up in the bed of Field Marshal Sheremetev, then gets traded to Prince Menshikov like a particularly interesting horse. When Peter meets her at Menshikov's house in 1703, she's already survived more than most royalty endure in a lifetime. The Tsar, fresh from torturing his own son to death, that's next section's horror show, decides this remarkably resilient peasant might be worth keeping around. Peter's courtship involves tests that would violate several Geneva Conventions. You're present when he forces Catherine to assist in his medical experiments, not observing, but actively participating as he dissects corpses and extracts teeth from living subjects who've annoyed him. She hands him tools while pregnant courtiers vomit, her face expressionless as Peter lectures on anatomy using a disemboweled enemy's intestines as visual aids. The mainstream historical fact is that Peter modernized Russia. The grotesque detail is that he measured his lover's worthiness by their ability to stomach his scientific sadism. The marriage itself happens in secret sometime around 1707. Historians debate the exact date because Peter kept changing his story. You watch them go through at least 3 different ceremonies, each more legitimate than the last, as if repetition could transform a peasant into suitable imperial material. Between weddings, Peter continues his loyalty tests. He openly takes other lovers, sometimes in Catherine's bed while she's still in it, watching for any sign of jealousy or weakness. When she responds by calmly embroidering, he rewards her with another estate. It's emotional torture repackaged as trust-building exercises. Here's the truly perverse twist. Catherine not only survives these trials, but learns to weaponize them. You watch her develop a public persona of absolute devotion while secretly building the power base that will let her rule after Peter's death. When Peter flies into his famous rages, she's the only one who can calm him, not through submission, but by matching his energy, once reportedly cooling his fury by dumping a bucket of ice water on his head and laughing. She bears him 12 children. Only 2 survive to adulthood. Each pregnancy, another test of endurance as Peter continues his wars, reforms, and torture sessions without pause for her comfort. The relationship reaches peak perversion during the Pruth River Campaign of 1711. The Russian army, surrounded by Turks and facing annihilation, is saved when Catherine secretly negotiates with the enemy, using her jewelry and possibly her body, accounts vary, to secure safe passage. Peter's response to his wife potentially prostituting herself to save his empire? He marries her again, this time publicly, crowning her as his co-ruler. You're at this ceremony, watching a Lithuanian peasant who can't write her own name being crowned empress, while aristocrats who know exactly how many men she's slept with bow deeply. By the time Peter dies in 1725, bladder infection, though poison remains possible because it's Russia, Catherine has survived 22 years of marriage as endurance sport. She's witnessed him torture their son, Alexei, to death, participated in orgies designed to humiliate court nobles, and played dead while Peter practiced autopsy techniques on her body to better understand female anatomy. The fact that she not only survives, but thrives, ruling Russia for 2 years after his death, suggests something beyond Stockholm Syndrome. You're watching a woman who understood that in Peter's Russia, marriage meant becoming either predator or prey, and chose accordingly. You're rifling through King Farouk's private collection in Abdeen Palace, Cairo, 1951, finding pornographic playing cards organized by breast size, stolen ceremonial underwear from visiting diplomats' wives, and what historians politely call medical illustrations, but are clearly just vintage porn labeled with fake Latin names. Egypt's last king has turned marriage into a collecting hobby, acquiring and discarding wives with the same obsessive categorization he applies to his pornography stash. The palace reeks of Turkish tobacco and the peculiar musk of a man who weighs 300 pounds and believes deodorant is for commoners. Farouk insists his natural odor is royal essence. The marriage collection starts with Queen Farida, wed in 1938 when Farouk still maintains the pretense of normalcy. You watch their wedding, a spectacular affair where the teenage king seems genuinely smitten, but within months, Farouk's true obsessions emerge. He installs two-way mirrors in the queen's quarters, not for security, but so he can watch her undress while eating his favorite midnight snack of champagne-soaked pigeons. When Farida produces 3 daughters, but no sons, Farouk's response isn't disappointment, but excitement. Now he has an excuse to start collecting more wives. Here's where Farouk's perversion gets systematically weird. You follow him developing what he calls his acquisition protocols, detailed flowcharts for adding women to his collection. Each potential wife gets a file with nude photographs, obtained through palace spies, measurements cross-referenced against his ideal proportions chart, and personality assessments focused entirely on sexual compliance. The quirky historical detail rarely mentioned? Farouk maintains a wife library where he catalogs his conquests using the Dewey Decimal System, complete with checkout cards tracking when he last borrowed each woman. The collecting intensifies after his divorce from Farida in 1949. You're present at nightclub raids, where Farouk spots attractive women and simply announces they're now part of his collection. Palace guards deliver terrified dancers to rooms decorated according to Farouk's filing system. Blondes get blue rooms, brunettes get green, redheads get a special crimson chamber with mirrors on every surface, including the floor. He marries his second official wife, Nariman Sadek, in 1951, but treats the wedding like acquiring a rare first edition, more excited about adding her to his catalog than any emotional connection. The pornography collection reveals the full scope of Farouk's marital perversions. You discover rooms containing over 50,000 pornographic items, each meticulously cataloged with acquisition dates, physical descriptions, and what Farouk calls arousal ratings on a scale he's developed involving mathematical equations. He forces his wives to reenact scenes from his favorite pieces, keeping detailed notes on their performances compared to the original artworks. When Nariman fails to match a particular French postcard's pose due to physical impossibility, Farouk spends 3 days calculating the exact angle discrepancy. But here's the truly disturbing part. Farouk's treatment of living women as collectibles extends beyond sex. You watch him literally inventory his wives like objects, conducting monthly condition assessments where palace physicians measure everything from hair thickness to vaginal depth, recording changes in leather-bound ledgers. He develops a complex trading system with other Middle Eastern rulers, proposing wife swaps like baseball cards. I'll trade you 2 dancing girls and a Circassian virgin for that Bedouin princess with the unusual birthmark. When negotiations fail, he keeps detailed records of ones that got away, complete with spy photos and acquisition strategies for future attempts. The collection meets its end during the 1952 revolution, but not before reaching absurd proportions. You're there when revolutionary officers discover Farouk's marriage museum, rooms where he's preserved wedding dresses, underwear, even used bed sheets from each conquest, labeled with dates and performance notes. One officer, finding a room full of plaster casts of various wives' body parts, reportedly asks, "Is this a palace or a medical school?" The tragic comedy peaks when they find Farouk's master spreadsheet attempting to calculate the mathematical formula for the perfect wife based on data points from his collection, complete with graphs showing the correlation between breast circumference and sexual enthusiasm. Farouk flees to exile, taking only his favorite pornography and leaving behind wives who discover they've been living as entries in history's most elaborate sexual catalog. The man who treated marriage like stamp collecting dies in Rome in 1965, reportedly choking on his dinner, though given his history, you wonder if he was attempting to add the waitress to his collection mid-meal. You're wandering through Neuschwanstein Castle in 1886, following Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria as he measures the exact distance between Wagner portraits, muttering about achieving harmonic architectural resonance, while his abandoned fiancée Sophie waits in Munich, still wearing the engagement ring from their betrothal 10 years earlier. Ludwig has elevated marital avoidance to an art form, building fairy tale castles to escape a wedding that exists only on paper while pursuing what historians delicately call intense male friendships with a succession of handsome stable boys, actors, and one particularly flexible Hungarian acrobat. The engagement to Duchess Sophie starts conventionally in January 1867, a cousin match arranged to produce Wittelsbach heirs. You attend the betrothal ceremony, where Ludwig appears genuinely happy, discussing wedding plans with an enthusiasm that surprises courtiers used to his theatrical melancholy. But something shifts after the engagement. Ludwig starts postponing the wedding date, first by months, then years, always with elaborate excuses involving astrological alignments, architectural obligations, or sudden needs to attend every single Wagner opera performance in existence, including rehearsals. Sophie, meanwhile, exists in matrimonial limbo. You watch her age from hopeful 20-year-old to resigned 30-something, still technically engaged to a king who communicates exclusively through formal letters discussing Wagner's use of leitmotifs. The mainstream historical fact is that Ludwig preferred men. The bizarre detail is how he turned avoiding his fiancée into a complex performance art. He builds entire castle wings specifically to prevent accidental encounters with Sophie during her mandated visits, complete with secret passages so he can flee if she appears unexpectedly. The perversion isn't in Ludwig's sexuality, it's in his transformation of architecture into marital avoidance. You explore Neuschwanstein's layout, realizing the entire castle is designed as an anti-marriage fortress. The throne room has no throne, avoiding succession implications. The bedrooms connect only to male servant quarters, and the planned chapel remains forever unfinished because completing it might necessitate an actual wedding. Ludwig spends millions on these architectural cockblocks, while Sophie knits increasingly aggressive doilies in Munich, each one spelling out variations of "just tell me you're gay" in elaborate lacework. Here's where it gets truly strange. Ludwig creates an entire fantasy marriage with Wagner's music as his bride. You attend midnight concerts where Ludwig sits alone in theaters he's rented entirely for himself, wearing wedding attire while orchestras perform Wagner's love duets. He writes passionate letters to Wagner's characters, not Wagner himself, but fictional creations like Lohengrin and Parsifal. Palace servants find these letters hidden in castle walls, declarations of eternal love to people who exist only in opera scores. One particularly unhinged missive proposes marriage to the concept of the Grail itself. Meanwhile, Ludwig's relationships with real men follow patterns that make Farouk's collecting seem straightforward. He develops elaborate fantasy worlds with his favorites, making his aide Richard Hornig dress as Lohengrin for midnight swanboat rides, forcing stable boy Joseph Keynes to reenact scenes from medieval romances in full armor during Bavarian winters. You shiver through one of these performances, watching a freezing actor recite courtly love poetry while Ludwig critiques his pronunciation of Middle High German. When lovers inevitably flee, because even royal favoritism has limits, Ludwig responds by commissioning castle rooms themed around their betrayal. The engagement finally ends in October 1867 when Sophie's father, recognizing his daughter's decade-long humiliation, formally breaks it off. Ludwig's response? Relief so profound, he immediately commissions another castle and throws a Wagner festival. But here's the twisted epilogue. He continues sending Sophie formal birthday greetings for the rest of his life, each card featuring commissioned artwork of Wagner characters in wedding attire, as if taunting her with the marriage that never was. Sophie eventually marries a French duke and reportedly burns every piece of Wagnerian music she encounters. Ludwig dies in Lake Starnberg in 1886 under mysterious circumstances, officially suicide, though the fact that his doctor also dies and Ludwig's autopsy shows no water in his lungs raises questions. You stand at the lake's edge, pondering whether this was murder, suicide, or just a king who built so many fantasy worlds he finally walked into one permanently. His legacy? 3 magnificent castles that serve as monuments to history's most expensive marital avoidance scheme, each one a stone love letter to the marriage he refused to have. You're squeezed into a Brighton parlor in 1785, watching Prince George, future George IV, marry Maria Fitzherbert in a ceremony so illegal it makes Ivan the Terrible's 4th marriage look legitimate. The prince, already developing the multiple chins that will eventually require specially reinforced furniture, gasps out wedding vows between dramatic sobs while Maria, a twice-widowed Catholic commoner, wonders if marrying into the British royal family violates more laws than robbing the Bank of England. Spoiler, it does. The Royal Marriages Act, the Act of Settlement, basic succession law, this wedding breaks them all with spectacular efficiency. The relationship starts with George's typical romantic strategy, theatrical suicide attempts. You watch him stab himself, carefully, avoiding vital organs, when Maria first rejects him, then send her blood-stained love letters accompanied by locks of his pubic hair, because nothing says, "Marry me," like hemorrhaging and genital grooming. Maria flees to France, but George bombards her with messengers threatening increasingly creative self-harm. One letter promises he'll dash his brains out against the marble pillars of Carlton House if she doesn't return, complete with a diagram showing which pillar he's chosen for maximum splatter visibility. Maria eventually returns, either from love or exhaustion, at managing a intercontinental stalking campaign. The secret wedding requires finding a clergyman drunk or desperate enough to perform it. Enter Reverend Robert Burt, fresh from debtor's prison and willing to commit light treason for $500. You're crammed into Maria's drawing room with a handful of witnesses as Bert races through the ceremony, sweating profusely, while someone watches for royal guards. The marriage certificate might as well be written in invisible ink for all the legal weight it carries. Here's the perverse part. George genuinely believes he can keep this marriage secret while living as publicly as possible. You follow the secret couple to the opera, where they share a box and George openly fondles Maria while whispering about discretion. He buys her a house on Park Street, visits daily in golden carriages bearing royal arms, then acts shocked when newspapers mention the prince's mysterious lady friend. The mainstream history admits their open secret. The weird detail is George's collection of disguises for sneaking to Maria's house, including a shepherdess costume that required two attendants to squeeze him into the corset. The marriage reaches peak absurdity when George needs money from Parliament, requiring him to marry properly. You watch him court Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 while still considering himself married to Maria. The official wedding to Caroline is a disaster. George is so drunk he has to be held upright, and he spends the ceremony making eye contact with Maria's friends, strategically placed in the congregation. He manages to consummate the marriage exactly once, producing Princess Charlotte, then sends Caroline a note saying her presence is no longer required, essentially ghosting his legal wife while returning to his illegal one. But George's marital perversions don't stop at bigamy. He maintains parallel households, parallel social calendars, even parallel wardrobes for his two wives. You attend excruciating dinner parties where guests must pretend not to know about whichever wife isn't present. Protocol develops for which events get which wife: Maria for intimate gatherings, Caroline for state functions, until Caroline's behavior becomes too embarrassing and she's exiled entirely. George then promotes Maria to semi-official status, creating a theological paradox where the head of the Anglican Church is openly living with a Catholic he insists he's married to despite all evidence to the contrary. The truly twisted element emerges in George's gaslighting campaign. When convenient, he denies the marriage to Maria entirely, including to Parliament, under oath, while she sits in the gallery wearing the wedding ring he gave her. When romantic, he insists she's his only true wife before God. You watch Maria age into a professional unwife, maintaining her dignity while George rewrites their history daily based on his political needs. She keeps every letter, every gift, every proof of their marriage in neat boxes, like a prosecutor preparing for a trial that will never come. By the time George becomes king in 1820, the marriage question has mutated into constitutional crisis. He tries to divorce Caroline, who's been living abroad with various lovers, while maintaining he was never really married to her because he was already married to Maria, who he also wasn't married to because it was illegal. Lawyers earn fortunes trying to untangle this matrimonial Gordian knot. George dies in 1830, reportedly calling for Maria, who outlives him by 7 years, long enough to watch history try to pretend their 40-year illegal marriage never happened while she sits in her Brighton house, surrounded by royal portraits and invalid wedding certificates. You're standing in the Palace of Alexandria, 47 BCE, watching Cleopatra VII explain to her 13-year-old brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII, why she needs him to sign execution orders for their mutual enemies while also consummating their marriage for dynastic purposes. The boy king, voice cracking with puberty, tries to assert dominance over his sister, who's 8 years older and approximately 8,000 times more politically savvy. This isn't just one incestuous marriage. You're witnessing the culmination of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic sibling-spouse traditions that make the Habsburgs look like pioneers of genetic diversity. Let's track this family wreath. Calling it a tree implies branches that diverge. The Ptolemaic dynasty begins with Ptolemy Wert, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who conquers Egypt and decides to go native by adopting pharaonic marriage customs, specifically the charming tradition of sibling marriage to keep power consolidated. You watch 14 generations of brothers marrying sisters, uncles marrying nieces, and in one spectacular case, Ptolemy the Eighth marrying his sister, then her daughter, his niece, then having children with both simultaneously. The palace genealogist just draws circles. The mainstream historical fact is that Cleopatra married her brothers. The disturbing detail is the bureaucratic normalization of these unions. You rifle through palace archives, finding standardized wedding contracts for sibling marriages, complete with pre-printed forms where scribes just fill in which brother-sister combination applies this time. There's actually a recurring dispute about dowry payments. Does a sister bride pay dowry to her brother husband from their shared inheritance? The legal scrolls attempting to resolve this paradox read like mathematical proofs written by madmen. Here's where the perversion gets systematic. The Ptolemies develop an entire theological framework justifying incest. You attend temple ceremonies where priests explain that pharaohs are living gods, and gods naturally marry their siblings, Isis and Osiris, the divine prototype. The fact that Isis and Osiris's marriage myth involves dismemberment, murder, and necrophilic resurrection apparently doesn't dampen the appeal. Courtiers nod solemnly, while prepubescent siblings are forced to recite marriage vows in ancient Egyptian they don't understand. The language itself, a dead tongue kept alive solely for incestuous wedding ceremonies. Cleopatra's first brother-husband, Ptolemy XIII, dies in the Civil War, drowned in the Nile while wearing golden armor because even death must be theatrical. So she marries her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who's about 11. You watch this second wedding, Cleopatra now firmly in control, the boy king stumbling through ceremonies while she runs Egypt and conducts affairs with Julius Caesar. The queen's solution to ruling with a child husband? Mercury poisoning, probably, though she has the decency to wait until after Caesar's assassination to dispose of this inconvenient sibling spouse. The sexual dynamics of these marriages defy comprehension. You're present for excruciating palace dinners where adult sister queens must pretend attraction to brother husbands who haven't hit puberty. Cleopatra, brilliant and politically astute, performs this charade while corresponding with Caesar about Plato and hosting scholarly debates. The cognitive dissonance reaches absurd peaks when she must interrupt discussions of Aristotelian physics to fulfill wifely duties to a 12-year-old who still plays with toy soldiers. Palace servants develop elaborate protocols for these encounters, including aphrodisiac wines for the boys and what amounts to instructional puppet shows. But here's the truly perverse legacy. The Ptolemies' systematic sibling marriage creates genetic disasters that make Charles II look robust. You examine palace medical records, helpfully illustrated, showing generations of increasingly unstable rulers. Ptolemy VI through 12 blur together in a parade of obesity, madness, and genetic disorders delicately referred to as divine afflictions. The famous Ptolemaic beauty, achieved through increasingly heavy makeup and careful angle management. Cleopatra's famous nose, which Pascal claimed changed history, probably the only feature not damaged by centuries of incest. The practice finally ends with Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, but not before she attempts to establish the tradition with her own children. You watch her negotiate with Mark Antony about which of their twins should marry each other, creating dynasties that would unite East and West through incest. Even facing defeat by Octavian, she's planning sibling marriages for babies, drafting betrothal contracts for toddlers who can barely walk. The perversion talk isn't just personal, it's institutional, so embedded in Ptolemaic identity that Cleopatra literally can't imagine royalty without incest. Rome's conquest of Egypt ends many things, but perhaps none more mercifully than a dynasty that turned sibling marriage into standard operating procedure, complete with forms, theological justification, and 300 years of genetic evidence that some traditions deserve to die. You're crouched outside the hunting lodge at Mayerling on January 30th, 1889, watching Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary share a final champagne toast with his 17-year-old mistress, Mary Vetsera, before they carry out history's most glamorized murder-suicide pact. The snow falls softly on the lodge where tomorrow morning servants will find Rudolph's brains splattered across Habsburg portraits and Mary's body arranged like a broken doll, clutching roses that match her blood. This isn't just another royal scandal, it's the violent culmination of a marriage so toxic it makes George IV's bigamy look like couples therapy. Rudolph's marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium started as dynastically as possible, two teenagers forced together for alliance purposes, smiling through ceremonies while privately nauseated by each other. You attend their 1881 wedding in Vienna, watching Rudolph, already showing signs of the syphilis he'd contracted from prostitutes, exchange vows with a girl who confided to her diary that her new husband smells of death and cigarettes. The wedding night sets the tone. Rudolph gets drunk, lectures Stephanie on Schopenhauer's philosophy of pessimism, then passes out before consummation, leaving his virgin bride to wonder if all marriages begin with existential despair. The perversion starts immediately, not sexual, but emotional. Rudolph, brilliant and unstable, treats his wife as an audience for his psychological disintegration. You sit through excruciating dinners where he describes his suicide fantasies in detail while Stephanie cuts her meat into increasingly smaller pieces. He gifts her revolvers for birthdays, suggests joint suicide as a romantic evening activity, and keeps a death mask collection in their bedroom for inspiration. And the mainstream history focuses on his politics. The grotesque detail is his habit of making Stephanie rehearse funeral arrangements, forcing her to practice mourning faces in mirrors. Enter Mary Vetsera, teenage baroness with a death wish that matches Rudolph's. You watch their affair unfold in Vienna's ballrooms, not a romance, but a mutual recognition between two people racing towards self-destruction. Their love letters read like suicide notes with erotic footnotes. Mary writes about wanting to die in his arms. Rudolph responds with detailed plans involving champagne, morphine, and matching bullets. Stephanie, meanwhile, discovers she's contracted syphilis from her husband, ensuring any future children will be born diseased. The marriage becomes a triangle of infection, deception, and death worship. Here's the quirky historical detail often sanitized. Rudolph's preparation for the murder-suicide includes forcing both women to participate in dress rehearsals. You watch him stage elaborate scenarios where Stephanie must pretend to find his corpse while he critiques her performance. More anguish, he demands. You're discovering your husband's body, not a mediocre breakfast. With Mary, the rehearsals turn sexual. They practice dying in various positions, experimenting with angles that will look aesthetically pleasing when discovered. Rudolph keeps notes rating each rehearsal, creating a macabre scorecard of staged death scenes. The final act at Mayerling unfolds with theatrical precision. Rudolph tells Stephanie he's going hunting, knowing she knows he's lying. Their marriage now just collaborative fiction. You follow him and Mary to the lodge, watching them consume a final meal where they discuss death like wedding plans. Who shoots whom first? What notes to leave? Whether to die naked or clothed? They make love surrounded by loaded revolvers and cyanide capsules, backup plans for backup plans. Their passion indistinguishable from Thanatos. Historians still debate whether Mary died willingly or Rudolph murdered her first, though her letters suggest enthusiastic participation in her own annihilation. The aftermath transforms tragedy into farce. The imperial family attempts cover-ups so inept they'd be comedic if not for the corpses. First, they claim Rudolph died of heart failure, then a hunting accident, then poison. Mary's body is smuggled out, propped between two uncles, pretending she's alive but drunk. You watch this grotesque puppet show, her corpse dressed and positioned in a carriage riding through Vienna while her uncles make small talk with guards. Stephanie, the survivor, spends the rest of her life known as the widow of Mayerling, her entire identity reduced to proximity to her husband's theatrical self-destruction. She remarries, but new husband finds her practicing funeral arrangements in mirrors, a habit she can't break. The perversion of Rudolph's marriage isn't just the adultery or the syphilis or even the murder-suicide. It's how he transformed matrimony into a death cult, making both wife and mistress accomplices in his thanatophilia. Every kiss was practice for a funeral, every embrace a rehearsal for rigor mortis. The Habsburg line that survived Charles II's genetic disasters finally found a new way to destroy itself. Through marriages that were elaborate assisted suicides, complete with supporting cast, dress rehearsals, and reviews. You're hiding in the Copenhagen Palace corridors in 1770, watching Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark writhe beneath her husband's physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, while King Christian VII sits in the next room, organizing his collection of toy soldiers by height and humming nursery rhymes. This isn't just adultery, it's a complete governmental takeover through the Queen's bed, where an ambitious German doctor transforms pillow talk into royal decrees that revolutionize Denmark, while the actual king plays with puppets and occasionally declares war on his own furniture. The marriage begins with warning signs visible from space. You attend the 1766 wedding where 15-year-old Caroline Matilda, sister of Britain's George III, yes, the one with two wives we met earlier, meets her cousin Christian for the first time at the altar. The teenage king spends the ceremony making barnyard noises and pinching courtiers, already showing signs of the mental illness that will define their union. The wedding night features Christian running circles around the bed, barking like a dog, while Caroline sits in her nightgown, wondering if someone's playing an elaborate prank. Spoiler, they're not. Christian's madness manifests in ways that make Ludwig II's Wagner obsession seem rational. You follow him through Copenhagen's brothels, where he doesn't have sex, but instead forces prostitutes to watch him act out elaborate plays where he's simultaneously all characters. He appoints his dog as a privy councillor, issuing official documents with paw prints. During state dinners, he might suddenly strip naked and demand everyone admire his divine radiance. Caroline Matilda, teenage bride in a foreign court, discovers she's married not to a king, but to a royal psychiatric patient with absolute power. Enter Struensee, hired as Christian's physician during a grand tour where the king's behavior horrifies European courts. You watch this bourgeois German doctor recognize opportunity in madness. He manages Christian's delusions while secretly seducing the desperately lonely queen. Their affair begins as medical consultations about the king's condition, but quickly evolves into something unprecedented, a complete shadow government run from Caroline's bedchamber. The perversion isn't the adultery, it's how they transform marital betrayal into constitutional revolution. Here's the bizarre detail historians love to debate. Christian not only knows about the affair, but actively encourages it. You're present when he literally locks Struensee and Caroline in rooms together, giggling outside about making royal babies. The king, in his madness, decides that since he can't perform sexually, he's convinced his penis is made of glass and might shatter. His physician should handle those duties. He issues written orders commanding Struensee to service the queen as medical treatment. Palace archives contain these documents, signed with royal seals and decorated with drawings of copulating stick figures. The sexual arrangement enables political revolution. Between orgasms, Struensee and Caroline draft Enlightenment reforms, abolishing torture, establishing freedom of the press, limiting noble privileges. You watch them conduct state business naked in bed, Caroline signing decrees with one hand while pleasuring Struensee with the other. They barely pretend anymore. Struensee moves into adjoining royal apartments, appears at Caroline's side during ceremonies, even styles himself regent, while Christian organizes battles between dolls representing various European powers. The mainstream history focuses on Struensee's reforms. The perverse reality is Denmark being governed by post-coital policy discussions. The arrangement collapses in 1772 when conservative nobles orchestrate a coup. You witness the midnight arrest, soldiers finding Struensee in Caroline's bed, the queen attempting to claim he's providing emergency medical treatment while obviously naked. The trial becomes pornographic theater, with prosecutors reading intimate letters aloud, while Christian, brought to testify, keeps interrupting to share his new theory that all humans are secretly furniture. Carolyn's letters to Struensee, discussing both anal sex techniques and tax reform in the same paragraph, become public entertainment. The execution provides the final perversion. Christian signs Struensee's death warrant while weeping, genuinely confused why his good friend must die. You watch the execution where Struensee's body is broken on the wheel, then beheaded, then quartered, while Caroline watches from a window, 4 months pregnant with his child. She's exiled to Cell Castle, where she dies at 23, officially from scarlet fever, but possibly poisoned. Christian continues ruling for another 36 years, increasingly insane, signing whatever documents handlers present between puppet shows. The marriage that began with barking ends with Denmark ruled by a madman who thinks he's a dog, while the lovers who actually governed lie dead, one quartered for treason, the other poisoned for adultery. Their brief enlightenment crushed beneath the weight of royal perversion. You're scrolling through Instagram in 2019, watching Princess Haya of Jordan post horseback riding photos from her English estate, while her husband, Sheikh Mohammed of Dubai, deploys Israeli spyware to track her location after she fled with their children and her bodyguard lover. The tools change: Pegasus malware instead of poison, helicopter gunships instead of hunting lodges, but royal marital perversion adapts like a virus, mutating to survive in each new century. From Charles II's genetic disasters to modern surveillance states, the powerful continue finding innovative ways to transform marriage into horror shows. The contemporary scandals feel quaintly familiar. Prince Andrew's connections to Jeffrey Epstein echo Caligula's institutionalized perversion, just with private jets instead of marble palaces. You watch him sweat through that BBC interview, denying everything while describing his inability to perspire, a medical impossibility as glaring as Charles II claiming fertility. The difference? Modern royals can't execute journalists for asking uncomfortable questions, though judging by some palace statements, they'd certainly like to try. Monaco provides reliable entertainment with Prince Albert's 2 acknowledged illegitimate children and counting, while his wife Charlene attempts escape with the determination of Caroline Matilda fleeing Denmark. You remember watching their wedding, where Charlene wept through the ceremony, tears the palace insisted were joy, with the same conviction Nero's court called Sporus an empress. She tried to flee 3 times before the wedding, passport confiscated each time, her situation less bride than prisoner with better jewelry. The swimming pool accident that kept her in South Africa for months. Modern royal wives don't get conveniently poisoned anymore. They develop mysterious illnesses requiring extended stays exactly where their husbands aren't. Here's the quirky modern detail. Royal perverts now hire PR firms to manage their dysfunction. You sit through press releases describing Prince Harry's naked Vegas photos as private moments unfairly publicized, or explaining how King Juan Carlos of Spain's elephant hunting with his mistress during an economic crisis was actually wildlife conservation. The same energy once spent on theological justifications for incest now goes into Instagram strategies and SEO optimization. Sheikh Mohammed doesn't just imprecise his daughters for trying to escape. He produces YouTube videos showing them happy in captivity, deepfakes being the modern equivalent of forcing Sporus to wear Papaya's clothes. The financial perversions might exceed the sexual ones. You trace offshore accounts where modern royals hide billions while their subjects suffer austerity. King Maha Vajiralongkorn of Thailand makes Farouk look financially responsible, maintaining a harem in German hotels while Thailand's economy crumbles. He promoted his poodle to Air Chief Marshal. At least Caligula's horse consul was metaphorical. The wedding to his bodyguard, broadcast nationally, featured her crawling on her stomach to receive royal blessing, a ceremony that would make Ivan the Terrible suggest perhaps toning it down. But technology enables new forms of marital horror. Princess Latifa of Dubai's escape attempts, tracked by satellites and thwarted by commandos, get live tweeted until she disappears again. You watch her smuggled videos pleading for help while her father's PR team insists she's receiving care. The modern tools, digital surveillance, social media manipulation, psychiatric imprisonment, allow royal families to maintain medieval control with Silicon Valley efficiency. Historians still argue whether Juana of Castile was mad or imprisoned. No such ambiguity exists when we have smartphone videos of princesses literally held captive. The true perversion of modern royal marriages? They pretend normalcy while maintaining ancient dysfunctions. You see Princess Diana's BBC interview admitting, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." The same complaint made by countless royal wives throughout history, just with television ratings. Meghan Markle discovers what countless foreign brides learned before her: marrying into royalty means becoming property, just with better lawyers drafting the contracts. The palace that once forced women to watch executions from bedroom windows now forces them to smile through racist abuse for Instagram engagement. 3 centuries after Charles II's genetic impossibilities, royal marriages remain laboratories for power's perversion of intimacy. The methods evolve. Murdered wives become diving accidents. Poisoned chalices become private planes that malfunction. Tower imprisonment becomes luxury house arrest. But the core remains unchanged. These aren't love stories or even political alliances anymore. They're demonstrations that sufficient wealth and power can transform any human relationship into grotesque theater. Whether it's forcing your castrated slave to wear your dead wife's clothes or tracking your fleeing wife with military-grade spyware, royal marriage continues to prove that power doesn't corrupt love. It reveals love was always just power wearing a veil. As we reach the end of our journey through royal bedchambers and throne rooms, you feel the weight of all these twisted tales settling like heavy blankets around your consciousness. The parade of perverted marriages, from genetically impossible Spanish kings to digitally surveilled Dubai princesses, begins to blur together into one long nightmare of power corrupting intimacy. Your eyelids grow heavier as you consider how little has changed. The methods evolved from poison to Pegasus spyware, from forced convents to forced Instagram posts, But the core perversion remains. Those with absolute power inevitably transform marriage into mirrors of their own dysfunction. Whether it's Nero surgically creating his dead wife's replacement, or modern sheikhs using Israeli technology to stalk escaped spouses, the powerful continue to treat human relationships as clay to be molded into whatever shapes their delusions demand. Let these stories drift through your mind like sedatives now. Picture Charles II drooling into his Habsburg chin, failing to consummate a marriage his genetics made impossible. See Juana of Castile combing her husband's corpse hair by candlelight. Watch Ludwig II measuring distances between Wagner portraits while his fiancée waits a decade for a wedding that will never come. These aren't cautionary tales, they're lullabies for a world where power and perversion dance an eternal waltz. Your breathing slows as you realize every royal marriage we've explored tonight was, in its own way, a small apocalypse. Each union destroyed something: genetic lines, sanity, lives, empires, from Rome to Dubai, from medieval Castile to modern Monaco. Marriage became the weapon power used against itself, creating dynasties that were really just elaborate suicide pacts with better costumes. So close your eyes now and let the madness of kings sing you to sleep. Dream of wedding ceremonies that are really funerals, of love letters written in blood and spyware, of genealogies that loop back on themselves like Mobius strips. Tomorrow you'll wake to your ordinary life, where marriage means something comprehensible, where love doesn't require castration or surveillance satellites, where wedding vows aren't death sentences. But tonight, in these last moments before sleep claims you, remember that somewhere in a palace, a royal marriage is beginning its transformation into tomorrow's historical horror story. Sweet dreams, and may your own relationships remain blissfully free of thrones, poison, and the terrible clarity that comes from absolute power corrupting absolutely.